Hello, I'm William Schweiker. I teach theology and ethics at the University of Chicago in the Divinity School and the college. Today we're going to be exploring a brilliant text by a Danish philosopher, theologian, poet, and author, Søren Kierkegaard, who lived from 1813 to 1855. The text, Fear and Trembling, is really about the limits on our ability to think the deepest questions we confront. It is framed around the story in Genesis 22, 1-14, called the Aggadah in the Jewish tradition, in which Abraham, the supposed father of faith, is commanded to bind and sacrifice his only son, Isaac. We're on a journey today, in and through this story and in and through Kierkegaard's complex text, in order to probe the question of the relation between religion and morality. The question of whether obedience to God's command to sacrifice his only son means that Abraham is a moral monster, or if he is, in fact, the father of faith. Those are two incommensurable understandings of Abraham. How could Abraham's obedience really be thinkable? Don't we shudder with disbelief and confusion when we hear of a child murdered by a parent, seeing this as an act of unspeakable and irrational evil? Indeed, we're going to see the precise reason why this is the case, since according to De Silencio, our pseudonymous author, thinking itself has an ethical and linguistic framework, which the command of God seems to negate, violate, and overturn. It's crucial to see in ways that might be very foreign to us that SK is using a religious text in order to engage in philosophical reflection about the limits of human thinking, human existence, and religion and morality. This is a work of the mind and one of the most profound and enduring questions in human existence. So we are thinking about a text that tries to be written in such a way that will enable us as readers, as people captivated by religious and moral questions, to think what seems to be unthinkable. That is Abraham, who has an absolute relation to God as a singular individual. Now we can make another step closer to the text that we're exploring and gather in what Kierkegaard means by his authorship and also the context of this work. We're on our way to Mount Moriah. What is the text before us? It was written in 1843, and Søren Kierkegaard uses pseudonyms in order to explore different forms of life, different forms of existence. This is written by Johannes De Silencio, John the Silent, an author who claims he cannot understand Abraham, and so he writes a dialectical lyric. Now, what in the world is that? It seems to be a paradox because a lyric is a poetic piece that seeks to recall Abraham's greatness, while also dialectically probing the figure of Abraham in relation to other figures and moving back and forth in contrast between characters. That's the dialectic. The title of the work is from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians 2:12. Quote, "One is to work out their salvation in fear and trembling." Now, Kierkegaard himself, who lived from 1813 to 1855, was not a man of his own age. In his life, he did not have great impact. In fact, no one was named Søren for over 100 years after his death, because he died amid a bitter dispute with the Danish church. But he had immense effect on the 20th and 21st century. More of that later. Now, I want to say something about the problem and method of the text, his idea of authorship, modes of existing, and the self's relation in truth to God. And with that background, we move closer then to the text itself. Kierkegaard's work is dominated really by one question. What does it mean to be an authentic self? And for him, more importantly, what does it mean to be a genuine Christian? He's not asking how you define a human being, or what are the doctrines of Christian faith, or even who was Christ, but rather, what does it mean to exist in a certain way, to exist as a Christian, to be a self? This is a question which can really only be asked from the inside, as it were. I can't ask what it would mean for me to exist as a Christian by looking up some creed or imitating people in the pews on Sunday morning, because I'm involved in the question. The work of this kind of thinking is bound to the work of living a life. And this poses a problem. If existing is a matter of the individual self, the inwardness of our existence, how can we communicate about this? Aren't we all just locked into our personal lives? Kierkegaard's entire authorship, that is the question of how we are to exist at all, raises this problem of communication. In other words, he realized that the question, what does it mean to be a self, cannot be answered simply in thought. I cannot think my way into being a professor, or being a custodian, or being a video producer. The question is a practical matter of our lives. Try an experiment to make this point. Pick out someone randomly on the street and tell yourself, as a rational, willing, decision-making being, that you're going to fall madly in love with them. I'll wait while you do the experiment. You see, existing as a self means coming to be as an actual self relative to various possible ways of being a self. And at this level of life, we are beyond reason in any strict sense, because we touch our deepest passions, our loves, our faiths, our anxieties. So Kierkegaard is setting up an existential dialectic. That is, he's examining from the inside our lives through looking at polar or opposites that constitute life. The dialectic tries to trace how we come to be as an actual self relative to possible ways of existing, and I'm going to say more about that in a few moments. But before doing so, we have to note another problem. If being self is an existential and not logical matter, then one cannot have a system of thought to answer this question. A system like Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who lived from 1770 to 1831, and about whom Kierkegaard said, Hegel's system covers everything except himself. So how are we going to think about the self? How are you going to communicate the matter? This is the problem that De Silencio confronts in trying to think about and communicate Abraham's mode of life, because there seems to be a profound uncommunicability of our lives, which all of us know if we've tried to express our deepest loves, our deepest anxieties, our deepest and most profound losses. Sometimes we just can't find the words. Now, Kierkegaard answers this problem of communication by developing a specific mode of communicating, a specific authorship. He wrote, as I noted, pseudonymous texts that attempt to enact or present different ways of existing. And this means he's engaged in what he called indirect communication about existence. That is, he's not speaking directly or systematically about existence, since one can't, but trying to communicate the problem of existence by confronting the reader with the question, how are you living? He once said his task is to wound from behind. Indirect communication is opposed in Kierkegaard's corpus to direct communication that he also wrote, speaking directly about Christian existence in two forms, sermons and edifying discourse, and reflections and discourses which ran him into problems with the Danish church. So here we have a crucial theme in existentialism, as it comes to be called, but also Christian faith. The fundamental issue of being a self, an authentic self, and how to communicate about this. This cannot be simply communicated through our usual thought and language. It must be undertaken by a self deciding to be a self. And that means confronting something that forces you to make a decision to exist in a certain way. It requires a crisis. And through the history of thought, different crises have been seen as provoking people to confront their existence and decide how they live. For most philosophers, the crisis is confronting death. For Kierkegaard and other Christian theologians, it's the event of Jesus Christ. In this text, the crisis arises out of the conflict between our human desire for eternal happiness, I assume all of you have that desire, in conflict with, for Abraham, a command to sacrifice his son. This brings us to the modes or stages of existence. Throughout his pseudonymous text, Kierkegaard presents roughly three stages or modes of existence, three possible ways of being a human within which there are many different options. And he hopes to wound us from behind so that we will confront the kinds of people we are and then move on to authentic faith and authentic life. So this gets complex, so please bear with me. In order to understand these stages, we have to understand that for Kierkegaard, the self is a dynamic dialectic. The self is a relation between the relation of polar elements. What do I mean? Well, we are all finite, we're going to die, and yet we're also free. We are in time, and yet we can imagine things that are eternal. We have actual lives, the lives we live, but we also have possibilities, ways to change and become different people. Who I am as a self is not just that I'm free and yet finite in time and can imagine the eternal, actual with possibilities. We all have those formal elements in our lives, but what makes me, me is the relationship I take to those dialectical polarities. Do I embrace them in joy, even know that I'll confront death? Do I fall into despair? Do I celebrate life, or do I secretly curse the day that I was born? Do I live in hope or quiet anxiety? Do I embrace my freedom or live in thoughtless conformity to the mass? This is strange. The self for Kierkegaard is not the polar relations, but the relation we take to those polar relations. This means that the self is not a thing, it's not a feeling, it's not our specific identities, say our genders or ethnic sense of who we are. The self is an acting process, the action to relate those polar elements in a specific way. And this gives us then three general modes of existing. First is the aesthete. Here the self is either lost in sensual or conceptual immediacy in all of its possibilities. So the bright young girl who goes from philosophy to philosophy to philosophy to philosophy, Or Don Juan is the example that Kierkegaard uses, who goes from woman to woman to woman to woman. Endless possibilities, but no real self, because a decision hasn't been made to exist as a self, and the aesthete ends in despair. Next is the ethical stage in his limited sense of the term. Here the self seeks to relate to itself in its awareness of the eternal validity of the moral law. This is crucial for Fear and Trembling, our text, because here the concern is an infinite interest in existing. But it attempts to do so through valid universal laws, to live up to all duties one faces, to never tell a lie. The ethical stage ends in guilt, because it tries to relate to the infinite that it cannot possibly fulfill. We see this in many kinds of tragedy. From this emerges the religious stage and two forms. What Kierkegaard somewhat unartfully calls religiousness A. And this is mysticism, a religious form of the aesthetic stage. Here the concern is for the self to lose itself in the immediacy of the sacred, to be absorbed into the divine. The self here is completely lost. Next, there's a religiousness B, which includes Abraham and Christianity. These are ethical forms of religion. The self relates itself to the eternal, valid duties, but here the eternal has entered time, either in God's command to Abraham or in the Christ. So in relating itself to the eternal in time, to the command of God or the Christ, the self relates its polar elements to another power that has established it, not to itself. And this relation to another power that establishes the self is what Abraham calls faith, authentic existence as he sees it. And this is what we're trying to understand in the text before us, and what De Silencio, who does not have faith, is trying to think about in this complex text. Thus, by presenting these modes of existence in literary form, Kierkegaard is trying to communicate indirectly about the problem of existence, to confront us with the problem of our own existence. And this is the point of Fear and Trembling, to confront the reader with a picture of faith, to expose the reader to themselves with respect to the religious mode of existing, and hopefully to move one to adopt that way of life. And this at last brings us to Fear and Trembling. First, the structure of the text. The book is confusing. It is a blending, as I've noted, of poetic and lyrical elements, as well as dialectical philosophical elements. It begins with a preface, and then an exordium, and then a eulogy to Abraham. In the exordium, De Silencio writes the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac from 4 different perspectives to get at dimensions of the text. In the first, Abraham raves that it is he and not God who desires to kill Isaac, and thereby Abraham saves God from blame. In the second, Abraham carried through the command, but in fact loses his faith in God. The third has it that Abraham sins because he forgot his duty to love himself, his son, and therefore falls into sin. In the fourth, Isaac sees his father in despair, such that he, Isaac, loses his faith. But of course, none of these renditions actually captures Abraham's faith. He accepted that the command of God was from God. He loved his son above all else. He carried out the command in full obedience. And yet he also believed that God would somehow still make him the father of many nations, that he would get Isaac back. Who can understand that faith? Is it madness? The text then turns in its dialectical moments to three problemata. One, is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? Two, is there an absolute duty to God? And three, was it ethically defensible for Abraham to conceal his undertaking from Sarah and Isaac? Kierkegaard, or rather De Silencio, introduces a range of concepts and also probes historical figures on a range of topics like the meaning of language, the ethical, absolute and eternal, the meaning of resignation, all in the attempt to understand what seems to be beyond our understanding, namely faith and Abraham as the father of faith. De Silencio insists that faith is a passion in a person, in fact, the highest passion. And in Abraham, we see a paradox. Quote, there is a paradox that the single individual, as a single individual, stands in an absolute relation to the absolute, and if not, Abraham is lost, unquote. Now we need to sort all of this out, and the core of the text is the conflict between faith and the ethical. These are knotty problems to unravel. Have no illusion that we'll unravel all of them today. We know already that Kierkegaard is trying to write in a way to explore and communicate what it means to exist, to use indirect communication. We know he wants us to explore the relation and difference between living a moral life and the life of faith, religious existence. We know that Kierkegaard, through the figure of De Silencio, structures the text in a certain way in order to highlight the oddity of Abraham and to contrast him with other figures, say the tragic hero, Agamemnon. And then it is also contrasted, Abraham's contrasted with the knight of infinite resignation. We know also that he wants us to explore faith as a passionate relation of the self in its existence in time to the eternal, to God. And we know that this text is aimed at each of us individually. It means to provoke reflection on our own existence. It is a work of mind that we're undertaking here. And this brings us to the real nub of the text, the relationship between the ethical and the religious. Can God command what is not ethical? Would it be immoral to obey God's command if that command is unethical? Is it possible with Abraham that there is a teleological suspension of the ethical? That means, is there a good, a human good, that allows us to suspend ethical obligations like our duty to love and care for one's children? In order to understand the argument, and thus to see how Abraham is the father of faith, we need to get clear on some ideas. Recall that for Kierkegaard, the ethical is a sphere of life defined by what is shared. He calls this the universal. And because of this, these shared duties and values can be spoken about, can be communicated. We tend to think that in a society, people have obligations to each other. They have certain duties with respect to their stations in life, and that society can communicate about these obligations and duties. Agamemnon is explored by De Silencio as a tragic hero because he faced the challenge of sacrificing his daughter in order to appease the gods and set sail for Troy, but in commitment to his community and its duties and obligations. He sacrificed his personal good, that is his daughter, for the good of the community. And because of this, he's seen as a hero. But the act is ethical, since it is in service of the good of the community, in defense of a specific form of life. And this is all understandable to us. We can communicate about it and draw comparisons with other tragic heroes, say Antigone in Sophocles' plays, who sacrifices herself because of her obedience and duty to her brother. But what about Abraham? He does not sacrifice Isaac for the community. In fact, Isaac's death would seem to mean the end of the community. Rather, this is done for himself, for Abraham's relationship to God. What is more, he seems to be reduced to silence. He does not communicate much with Sarah and Isaac. What are we to compare him with, and how? So what is at issue here? It is important to see the crucial difference between the ethical and the religious as Kierkegaard is using these ideas. The ethical, for Kierkegaard and in Fear and Trembling, demands that an individual translate their existence into general shared obligations and languages. Ethically, we can speak about all good men being good men, all heroines being heroines, one who does their duty. But what matters is not the individuality of the self, but conformity to the shared values and obligations of a community. And this is crucial for the actual functioning of any society. But the religious stage would seem to be different if we take Abraham as our guide, which De Silencio is doing. Here, the individual in their solitariness is what matters. And they are in a relation not to universal ethical norms, but what De Silencio calls the absolute. That is, a living relation to God as itself a living reality relating to the individual. Before the absolute, the individual must confront whether or not they are obedient to God and loving God. They confront the problem of faith, which is, unlike a duty, a relation to the absolute. It is about the individual self in their individuality. So now we confront the problem, and we see why the body of this text, the various problemata, are taken up. First, is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? That is there a good, a telos, an end, a purpose, that is higher than one's conformity and obligations to the ethical and one's society? If there is, then Abraham is the knight of faith, because he lived in an absolute relation to the absolute, to God. He suspended the ethical relation to his son in order to have an absolute relation to God. But if there is no suspension of the ethical, then Abraham is, quite frankly, a monster. Quoting from the text, "For faith is this paradox, that the particular is higher than the universal, and that consequently the individual, after having been in the universal," Abraham was a father of a son, "but now as the particular isolates himself as higher than the universal, if this is not faith, then Abraham is lost." So not the tragic hero, the one who sacrificed the particular for the universal. It's not Agamemnon. It's not Antigone. It's not all the heroes we know in our country who have sacrificed their lives or their children for the sake of being first responders or serving in the military or in the police force or protesting for the sake of some community. What is more, while the hero acts for the sake of the community, Abraham acts, as De Silencio puts it, for God's sake and for his own sake. Notice further, a person can become a tragic hero on their own power. Agamemnon has the capacity to sacrifice his daughter and then be seen as a hero by his community. Not so the Knight of Faith. It requires a relation to God, God's initial command to Abraham. Now the second question becomes, and the second problemata, is there an absolute duty to God? Here things turn on a distinction I've been drawing, or rather De Silencio draws, between the universal, that is, the relation of an individual to shared obligations and values, and the absolute, that is, a relation of the individual to God that cannot be understood or translated into shared values and obligation. The paradox of Abraham is that he has an ethical relation to his son. He's a father. He loves Isaac with his whole life. And yet he is called into an absolute relation to the absolute by God's command to sacrifice his son. De Silencio writes, quote, "The tragic hero renounces himself in order to express the universal. The Knight of Faith renounces the universal in order to become the individual." What dread this brings, what utter distress, what fear and trembling. How can an individual claim to have an absolute relation to the absolute? The temptation for Abraham is to forego faith and join the ethical community. But if he does so, he's no longer the father of faith. So here we have a paradox. Either there is an absolute duty to God, so that the individual can be higher than the universal, or not. And then faith does not exist, and Abraham is lost. And this brings us to the third problemata. And if you followed me so far, and if we see that language itself is an ethical reality, that is to say, ethics is a social system that requires we communicate to each other with respect to rules and norms, that's called grammar, that make sense of ourselves and others. If that's the case, then Abraham can't speak. The particular cannot express itself in the universality of language. Part of what it means is the challenge placed before this text as a work of the human mind is how Abraham, as an individual in obedience to the absolute command of God that suspends the ethical and yet believes God will fulfill his promise, can he say anything about this? Can he speak? Can he tell his wife what is going on? Can he say anything to Isaac? Or is all of that suspended as well? And then how are we to think and speak about this man? That's De Silencio's problem, and why he uses the various strategies of communication seen in the text. And in fact, the ethical, to communicate his situation, is the temptation, ironically, for Abraham. He will make a movement of infinite resignation by giving up Isaac. And yet, at the same moment that he's resigning Isaac to seeming death, he makes the movement of faith that he will, by virtue of God's promise, get Abraham back. If there is faith, then there is the paradox of Abraham, who is tempted by the ethical but resists it, and then is unable to communicate his resistance. We see then how Kierkegaard, in the voice of De Silencio, a properly named pseudonym, works through various levels of the conflict between religion and the ethical, and he concludes that one generation cannot learn how to exist from the previous one. We all confront the problem of how to exist in truth in relation either to the ethical or the absolute. De Silencio puts it, faith is the highest passion in a human being. because it is the question of being an individual, an authentic self. But faith is a paradox. So the text here ends not with an answer neatly packaged in a philosophical box. It rivets us with a question. Is Abraham the father of faith, the individual in an absolute relation to the absolute, the most singular and memorable individual, or is he a monstrous murderer? We marvel at Abraham, maybe even admire him, but can we make the movement of faith? Maybe we are horrified at this man and his strange, dangerous God. And then religion seems like madness and must be controlled by rational and moral and political duties. Maybe we are convicted and will make the movement of faith. Who can tell? Oddly, this text might well reduce us to silence about these most crucial decisions of life. It is a work of the mind about the limits of thinking and communicating. And yet, paradoxically, we've been thinking and communicating about it in and through this text. That is what makes Fear and Trembling a classic work of thought. Now, while some connections, personal reflections for a moment. While Kierkegaard did not have great impact on his own day, he did have deep influence in the 20th century on various existentialist philosophers and theologians, an array of luminaries like Paul Tillich, Karl Barth, Rudolf Bultmann, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Dostoevsky. And he continues to enjoy influence and new ways of speaking and thinking. In our age of skepticism, facile religion, obsession with people's identities, and religious violence, the work of this poet, cum philosopher, cum theologian, is worth engaging reflectively about precisely these matters, both in terms of their possibilities and their dangers for authentic existence. I actually wrote on Kierkegaard in my doctoral dissertation, and I have taught his work throughout my career and directed dissertations, doctoral dissertations on his work. And while I have always been deeply concerned about how our lives are embedded in and shaped by social, biological, political, economic, linguistic, and technical systems, I have always shared Kierkegaard's concern to protect, to respect, and enhance the lives of individuals against oppressive systems. And from his authorship, I have learned to try to advance how life must be explored from multiple perspectives and dimensions. In his case, the work of the pseudonymous authors and the dialectic. I've also learned the fact that each human being exists in the world in a distinctive way, and this makes communication the basic challenge of human life, as well as the question of faith and authentic existence, or what I would call the integrity of life. If you are taken with this thinker and this kind of text, let me recommend some readings before I conclude. First of all, turn to his works themselves, like The Concept of Anxiety or either in the Cambridge History of Philosophy editions or in the Princeton edition of his work. The introductions to these volumes are very good. I also can recommend, for those who just want to get a sense of the whole, put their toes in the water of the ocean of Kierkegaard, Patrick Gardner's Kierkegaard, A Very Short Introduction, Oxford 2002. And then one of the most well-known scholars of Kierkegaard currently, C. Stephen Evans, Kierkegaard, An Introduction, Cambridge 2009. Well, I've gone on long enough, I suppose. I hope you have some sense of how great this book is as a work of mind on topics at the very limits of human understanding. But in closing, two thoughts remain. It is clear in our time that radical religious fanaticism, which acts supposedly on the command of God to destroy lives, explode buildings, engage in acts of suicide bombing, it should be clear that something is terribly wrong and evil. And in this context, the text before us pushes us to insist that Abraham did not negate the ethical. It was suspended for a moment. And then he re-enters the ethical realm. Don't we need to enter again in our time these perplexing questions of the relation of religion and morality, and how religion cannot negate, even if at moments it might suspend, the ethical? It is not clear to me, secondly, that our culture takes any of these matters seriously. Do we have tragic heroes? Do we have a commitment to universal moral obligations, really, if we're honest? Can we even imagine what a relation to a living God might mean? Or have our moral and religious sensibilities been stunted, lost? Put otherwise, we cannot learn to love or believe or live simply by relying on previous generations. The question of our own existence returns. How will we respond? I suppose this is why the text is titled Fear and Trembling. And so working out one's own salvation, one's own existence. And hopefully this text by Søren Kierkegaard has helped us to ponder what that fear and trembling is all about. Thank you.